Hope everybody is doing well on this particular Friday. It's a hot Friday here. That's right, a hot Friday here in Durham, North Carolina. It's been hot for several days, and I don't think it's going to be getting any cooler. And I've actually got to go do a festival on tomorrow afternoon here in Durham, North Carolina that celebrates the environment, celebrates 4th of July because it is the 4th of July weekend. And a lot of people are going to be doing an extended 4th of July since the 4th is following on a Tuesday. But definitely that is some of the things that are going on here in Durham, but a lot of things are happening in the world, including some things that definitely Nick Palveda, one of the founders of the network, has been following because a number of them have to do with law. And he is definitely in that law space as a pension attorney and having done a number of other things as well. So the U.S. Supreme Court has said that it's going to ban colleges from considering race in affirmative in admissions. So definitely it has struck down the affirmative action in college admissions. And that is one of the cases that is out there in the legal realm. The Supreme Court is also set to rule on the student loan forgiveness plans, and it announced its decision on gay rights cases as well. So it's still got some other cases that'll be coming down the pike on this particular day and all in that way. Elizabeth Warren, a former presidential candidate, said it's personal and that President Biden has the legal authority to cancel student loan debt, and she's calling an act for action right now. But will that actually happen or will that not happen? That will be something that will be interesting to see and all in that space. And by the way, speaking of cases in the law, the jury has acquitted Scott Peterson, ex-deputy accused of failing to protect the students in the Parkland shooting. So that is another legal case that is out there as well. And it looks like California's historic work on possible African American reparations is moving to the legislature. So it looks like that may be heading to the legislature over there in California and all along those lines. So that's some of the things that are happening in the world. I'll get to a couple of other things as well, because yes, in terms of the California case, that California's historical work on reparations has moved to the legislature, and I guess it's going to be not just the African American community, but possibly also the Latino community and the Asian community as well. And New York City libraries were apparently spared a $36 million in budget cuts. So yes, those things are very important, our libraries and all along those lines. So the 107 billion New York City budget deal spared the libraries, but it gave cuts in the world famous prison Rikers and all in that space. So it definitely gave cuts in that area. I'm thinking maybe for administration, maybe for the guards, maybe for a number of other things, including some of the things that are given to the prisoners while they are there. But I have to look and find out more about that and what's going on there. And, like I said, the weather is definitely in the news. The temperatures are set to rise in California as the South here in the U.S. is definitely dealing with some hot weather. And I know that was the case yesterday, even though I got out to an area around Duke and it wasn't stopping folks from being out there in the golf course. But definitely, hey, some folks are able to brave the heat better than others. And I'm sure that they were having plenty of hydration to make sure that they were doing all right and all along those lines. And Florida's concealed carry gun law will be starting on July 1st. So as new gun laws go into effect in that part of the country, gun shop owners and police in Polk say that some folks are confused about what the exact law is and all in that kind of way. And, it's not just laws that are going into effect in Florida. It's laws all over the country, because apparently more than 170 laws were passed in Tennessee this year and 18 go into effect on July 1st, since that is the beginning, I think, of the fiscal new year. So definitely a lot of things are going to be taking place, new laws all over the country and all in that kind of way. As a matter of fact, one of those new laws is in Michigan. Michigan has a new distracted driving law that goes into effect on today. So it's now illegal to hold your cell phone while driving in Michigan. So that is where a lot of folks are feeling that folks are getting distracted and all in that kind of way. So that is a law that went into effect there. And an Indiana power outage has 139,000 people in the dark. Restoration is going to be a multi-day effort. So storms packing high winds hit Indiana and Illinois, cutting power to more than 400,000 customers altogether in that area because of the weather that was going on in that space. And of course, air quality is a big news story all over the area. I know North Carolina doesn't have the best air quality because of the Canadian fires, and I understand that others don't have the best conditions either, including some there in the Northeast and all in that space. And a America's Most Wanted, Donald Santana, was arrested in a 1984. So he's been returned to Florida after his arrest in California. So he was been a suspect and he's been on the run for 39 years, but they finally apprehended him and returned him to the area where the alleged crime was committed and all in that space. So definitely we're going to see what's going on in that way. I'm going to get to some news items and I'm bringing in my very special guest who I'm looking forward to having a conversation with and seeing what he's got to say about a number of things that are going on in the world, including things around the budget and all in that space. So hundreds were arrested as France was rocked by a third night of fiery protest over the shooting of a teen by the police, a fatal shooting in that particular case. And Russian flyers who disobeyed orders to attack Wagner forces may be caught up in some of the stuff that is going on between Putin and some of his former allies and all in that kind of space. So a lot of folks are trying to figure out what the Wagner Group role will be now in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and also how long this war will be going on. It's been going on for more than a year, almost coming up on 2 years and all in that space. So definitely it looks like Ukraine has hit Russia's defenses from a distance before risking troops. So it definitely looks like they are using aviation. Russians are using aviation to advance on the Avgada front. And that is something that we are seeing in the news as well. So, and China is tightening Xi Jinping's power against the West with new laws. Speaking of new laws, so new Chinese laws are raising risk for American firms in China. And a stabbing in a class over there in Canada is also one of the items in the news because a new the stabbing in a class at Canada's University of Waterloo wounded professors, 2 students, and folks, of course, are wondering about that. I know sometimes Lee talks about gun violence versus stabbings, and yes, even in the other parts of the world, stabbings can be what is the cause of the attacks just as much as the guns. But right now, I'm going to bring in none other than the special guest that I've got, who is none other than Norman Solomon. And I'm glad to have Norman Solomon with me and all in that space. Norman Solomon is the author of War Made Invisible. And I know a lot of times, as one that was actually a member of Amnesty International when I went to school at Marquette, that we oftentimes would think about war. We would think about what was going on. And it seems like it's a different world. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about this because I know there was a time that we maybe didn't see as much of the wars, but now they're constantly in our face. They're constantly happening. Sometimes we're not even sure the purpose of the war. And I know some folks that are friends of mine that have been in the military and they weren't always 100% sure why they went to the war that they went to. And sometimes they didn't even agree with the policy of the war that they went to. But as a military person, you are oftentimes, directed to go into battle. And it isn't always a battle that you agree with. And I think that was the case in Vietnam. I think that was the case in some cases in Afghanistan and in a number of other places as well. But I'd love to hear your thoughts about that, Mr. Solomon, as you have written this book called War Made Invisible. And a lot of times we are constantly getting these images of war ever since the 9/11. And sometimes there's this notion of, I know we've talked about on this show before, of otherism, where we sometimes think that we're going against whoever that other is and everything. And that can sometimes be an issue as well. But I'd love to hear some of your thoughts.
Yeah, well, thank you. As you mentioned, often people are engaged in warfare. They've joined the US military and they don't necessarily agree with the war. They have virtually no say. And in many ways, the wars are becoming more invisible When you think back to the invasion of Iraq a little bit more than 20 years ago, at least we saw media coverage. It was on TV. There were what were called boots on the ground. And there was awareness in the United States that there were people around the country who were going to the war. They were on the ground. They were often engaged in combat. And we saw images, we saw narratives about the warfare going on with our names, with our tax dollars. There has been a lot of change because in the last 20 years, the US has pulled troops out of Iraq and then out of Afghanistan as well, but relied more and more on what you might call push button war, console war, people sitting behind computers firing missiles or drone strikes from thousands of miles away. And I call the book War Made Invisible because as these wars have continued, and the US has continued the so-called war on terror for more than 20 years, those wars have become less and less visible to the American public, which after all is supplying the people power to keep the wars going and supplying the billions of dollars being spent every week for the Pentagon. The ultimate questions then come to, I think, what is the meaning of the United States continuing to be at war now well over 20 years? And we have less and less awareness about the effects of those wars on people in the United States with PTSD, with injuries that are physical, that are emotional, that are social, and also the reduction of the resources that are needed in our country for healthcare, education, housing, infant care, elderly care. Dr. Martin Luther King in 1967 referred to the excessive military spending as, and I'm quoting here, a demonic suction tube. And in 1967, that was the case. It's also true in 2023. Another aspect of the invisibility of ongoing US wars is that people who have suffered at the other end of the US firepower have more than ever become invisible. So the Cost of War Project at Brown University has documented that well over 300,000 civilians have been directly killed by the US war on terror, as it's been called, since the fall of 2001. Those people are invisible as well. So I just sort of sum up, Mark, by saying that we're facing an ongoing, hidden, moral, ethical, and you might say spiritual crisis where our own society in the United States is paying the bill and at least tacitly, passively supporting the killing overseas that has terrible effects here at home as well.
No, along those same lines, and you kind of alluded to it, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about it. As a youngster growing up in the 70s, because like I said, I was in college in the early 80s and all in that space, I remember some of those very graphic images that took place with war. And I think that sometimes fuels the kind of angst that we had about war during that time. There was the famous individual that was shot in, I believe it was Vietnam, and all in that space. And there were a number of other things. I don't know that we see that as much now and all in that space. And even some of the movies like Apocalypse Now and stuff like that definitely showed you the terror of war. But I don't know that that is as prominent as it used to be. But I'd love to hear your thoughts about that and whether maybe the media is being complacent in some of what they are doing in not covering as much the human cost of war.
Media complacent, also you might say complicit. We have the reality that on our screens, TV, on the radio, back on our device screens, we're generally seeing less and less about any aspect of the consequences of what Dr. King called the madness of militarism here in 2023. And a consequence is that for American society, there's less and less of a sense that the United States is at war at all. But people who are suffering from the drone strikes, people who are in war zones where the United States is still involved with special ops, with drone attacks, with other airborne assaults, they know what's going on. They're experiencing the results of the ongoing warfare from the United States. But meanwhile, the invisibility of that war for Americans helps it continue. And there's a lack of accountability. The president of either party in the last couple of decades, less and less is held accountable for the consequences. And I should say that even when we were getting a lot of media coverage back during the Iraq War and so forth, there was a type of invisibility in that we saw what it was like for the people who were firing the missiles, those who were on the aircraft carriers, those who were the US side of the war. We saw the missiles go off sometimes. We didn't really see the human consequences of what happens when the missiles land. And that remains the case. Ultimately, we're faced with the question that is rarely even raised by news media in the United States or by political leaders in Washington, and yet is a profound moral ethical question, which is, how can we as a country deny the reality of what our own nation is doing, what our own government is doing in terms of warfare in other countries? And in my book, War Made Invisible, I talk about how, in effect, there are two layers of grief, two tiers of grief. The human suffering of US troops, and by extension, the suffering of civilians in Ukraine who are suffering from the brutal Russian war on that country. And that coverage humanizes those human beings, as should be the case. But the other tier of grief, the other layer that we're not getting from US media or politicians, has to do with the suffering, the grief of people in Libya, in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in many countries in Africa, who have directly felt the brunt of the burden of US war on so-called war on terror. And when you have two tiers of grief, when you separate humanity on this planet into two categories, those who we are caring about and those who we are subtly and not so subtly instructed not to care about, then that really speaks to what Martin Luther King referred to as approaching spiritual death, where so many of our resources are going into killing and relatively little towards sustaining human life.
And along those same lines and everything, I was just wondering, a lot of times we hear about the military industrial complex and all in that space, and a lot of money from Congress, and it seems like both parties always are agreeing, are oftentimes constantly raising the budget, whether they are creating new firepower, whether that is aircrafts or a number of other things that are going on in that space. So, Mr. Solomon, I'd love to hear your thoughts about the responsibility of our political leaders in this notion of war and everything as well, because I do know that every time there is a military budget, the one thing that doesn't seem to get cut, it actually seems to get increased, at least in what I am seeing and studying. It seems as that is oftentimes the military that is least impacted by these cuts and everything. But I'd love to hear your thoughts about that, because we definitely have had, and I think Lee mentioned it earlier, even Dwight Eisenhower talked about the establishment of a military industrial complex and all in that space. And I'll be bringing him and Sashi in very shortly, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about our military spending.
It's a key point, because the increases in military spending, and I don't call it defense spending because not all that much of it is really for authentic defense of this country. It keeps going through the roof, and it's bipartisan. President Biden asked for a little bit more than $800 billion for the next fiscal year, but that wasn't enough for the Democrats and Republicans in Congress. They upped it even further. And then President Biden signed the appropriations of what's called the National Defense Authorization Act, and he glorified it, as Trump did, as Obama did, as Bush did. And so this is very chronic. And the spending, of course, is very lucrative for very rich people who've invested in aerospace companies, other military contracting corporations. So they're making out like bandits. They're making a killing, so to speak. But meanwhile, whether you're in North Carolina or California, where I am, or pretty much anywhere in the United States, not too far from where you are, there are people who are suffering from the lack of spending for basic human needs. And more than half of the US discretionary budget now is going to the military. this is so chronic. It's sort of like the wallpaper that after a while we don't even notice. It's the white noise that keeps going. After a while, we're so accustomed to it. And one of the purposes for me in writing this book is to say we need to wake up because this is life that is at stake.
No doubt about that. I want to bring in Lee Newton Rhodes, who is actually a presidential candidate, and all along those lines, he's running in one of the independent ways of running, and all along those lines. And I also want to bring in Sasha Starr, who is originally from the Ukrainian area, but is now living in Canada, and actually does a show after this called Ukraine, Russia, China, and definitely does that every Tuesday and Friday, and oftentimes is talking about what is happening in that war, which you alluded to earlier as well. And one of the things that I want to put words in Sasha's mouth, but I'm going to mention something that he has brought up, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about it. But Sasha several times has talked about how the Ukraine war is a war for the entire freedom of the human race and everything, because there is no American military person that is being out there actually in the war efforts. There may be a few mercenaries here and there, but it's not that many lives that have been lost that are American. But Sasha can explain that better than I can, but I think that I am saying it fairly in everything, Sasha. But if you want to explain it further, then I will definitely turn it over to you. But I would love to hear your thoughts, and also Lee Newton Rhodes as well.
Thank you. I would recommend to look at the big picture. The big picture is that there is a country, we used to be Soviet Union, now it's Russia, who has capabilities to destroy all world, including United States, several times over and over. The threat is real. This is the most important thing, what has to be on minds of scientists and writers and journalists or anybody else, to do anything what can prevent that war. And the only thing, in my opinion, what can prevent its war is to get Russia defeated by Ukraine or any other power, but Ukraine is one who is actually doing that, and very successfully at that, in spite of the US and NATO is not delivering all things what it should to enable Ukraine to win decisively and in very short time, but Ukraine is still doing that. This is by far important thing, because if the Russia's threat would be liquidated, then we are going to live in very different world. So then we can think more about saving human lives, being more a humanistic society, and many other threats. Until then, the threat of annihilation is just too large to talk about anything else. Thank you.
Sasha, RFK on his campaign trail just made a comment the other day that this war was really unnecessary, and Russia was pushed into it because there was a peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine. The United States and some other countries told them, but basically broke, did not want them to have peace. I put the comment in the chat session. I can send you the link if you want. Well, I don't agree with what Putin is doing. It's not that other people don't have blood in their hands.
I'm not sure whom you're quoting is, but if that's
RFK, he's a president's candidate. He's out there. He's very vocal. He's being silenced by the media.
Who is the RFK? One more time.
Robert Kennedy Jr. He's running against Biden also.
I see. What is he? Philosopher? He's a scientist. What is he?
He's a politician and he's a person.
Politician.
Why is that relevant if he has facts?
It's relevant because if he is politician and he is voicing very stupid, idiotic things, then obviously you should not continue to quote him, because the RFK, okay, something new to me. Okay.
Yeah, that was Nick that up there and everything. Hey, Norma, just really quickly, how important do you think it is for us, because it's come up in some of our conversations before. There's this notion of America as the police force of America, I mean, of the world and everything. But I was wondering your thoughts about that. We have definitely gone into other countries sometimes because they are seen as a strategic ally. They're not always even a ally that we agree with, because there have been dictators that we have supported as well. But what is your thoughts about this notion of us as the world's police?
Well, we need a single standard of human rights. We should condemn what Russia is doing in Ukraine. We should condemn what Saudi Arabia is doing with U.S. support in Yemen, where 200,000 people have been killed in less than a decade by the Saudi-led, U.S.-supported war on that country. I can remember when people said the Vietnam War had to be pursued and the United States and South Vietnam had to win because that was so important, and 3 million people were slaughtered. So we don't need what George Orwell in 1984 called doublethink, where we have one set of standards for one country and another set of standards for another country. That just doesn't make sense. When we tell people around the world, do as we say, not as we do, people are not going to believe it as time goes on. So I certainly support the Ukrainian people. I also support the people in Yemen who have been killed thanks to support from the United States government. So we ought to be even-handed about this. We ought to be clear about the humanity of all people around the planet, and also understand that while we should always condemn what Russia is doing in Ukraine, the fact is that the United States, contrary to promises from the George Herbert Walker Bush administration, expanded NATO up to Russia's borders. And imagine if there were US missiles that were facing Russian missiles along the Canadian border or the Mexican border. I don't think people in Washington would be too happy about that. So it's the hypocrisy and the willingness to apply double standards to the world that really will not fly in the long run. People see through it.
Excuse me, I would like to clarify one thing. When you're talking about that it was promised that the NATO borders will not move closer to Russia, this is not only wrong, it's an impossible posture even to keep, simply because the mechanism of countries joining NATO is that the country making application to join NATO, the country feels that politically, from defensive points of view and many others, it's good for this country. Let's say take Poland, for instance. So Poland felt that after the Soviet bloc was gone, the Soviet Union no longer exists, they thought that for their security, it would be good to join not only NATO but European Union, which they did as well. So now the next step, NATO is taking a valuation of proposal of single country of Poland, for example, and they say, okay, we can get you into NATO, except that you have to do certain steps, and they clarify which exactly steps they have to do, and if they will do those steps, they would be admitted to NATO. Same thing happened to Czech Republic and Hungary and many other countries. So in Bush, when he opened his mouth, if he did, because it's not certain, it's never been proven that he made these promises. And if he did make these promises, it's invalid because he cannot deliver something that NATO, as a mechanism of which United States is only one member, what he could say that if any Eastern European country is making application to NATO, United States will decline and will not approve it. And for how many years? For 10 years, 100 years, 700 years? Who is Bush to make these assertion promises and talk like that? It's a NATO who is accepting or is not accepting. So, or another way around is to go like Putin did with Ukraine, go to Poland, go to Hungary, to Czech Republic, Baltic republics, and all over the world, if you will, and make sure that this country will never make an application. Otherwise, Russia will throw nuclear weapons and destroy the country and so on. Otherwise, what kind of mechanism is there? Please, Norman, explain.
Well, I'll address that. The United States is the major force in NATO. As you know, admission to NATO has to be unanimous from existing members. And let's ask, yes, Poland applies, Poland gets into NATO, and Poland puts missiles, which are called ABM, but can be quickly retrofitted into offensive weapons along a border. And
Great.
within just minutes can hit Moscow
That's
with
great.
missiles. That is reality. Now, you're in Canada. How
Yes.
would you feel about Canada putting missiles along the border, on the Canadian side of the border, just over that border from, say, Michigan or Washington State or the state of New York? And then there are missiles pointing at the United States from just over the border. But the Canadian government decides that that's okay because they have the freedom to do that and align themselves in a so-called defense pact with Russia. I think in Washington, they would completely freak out. They would say that is totally unacceptable, just as President Kennedy said it was unacceptable to have missiles in Cuba that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So do as we say, not as we do, is not only hypocritical, it is dangerous. We have the dangers of nuclear war right now because the two nuclear superpowers, Russia and the United States, are in conflict in Ukraine. So let's believe in diplomacy rather than we're going to posture that we're going to defeat the other country. It ain't going to happen. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy gave a speech at American University, and he said that in the nuclear age, when all of humanity is at stake, we cannot be in a situation where the leader of a nuclear superpower is backed into a corner and feels that he has no option but to launch nuclear weapons. The posturing that we're getting now from US news media and politicians in Washington that we have to force, we have to win, no negotiations, making diplomacy a absolutely dirty word. That is what Dr. King called the madness of militarism. Diplomacy is essential unless we feel that it's okay to go ahead and push the envelope to nuclear war that would destroy, according to the best evidence from scientists, 99% of humanity because of the result of nuclear winter from nuclear conflagration. That is not a good option.
Hey, Norman, along those same lines, I know, hold on a second, Sasha. Norman, along those same lines, we've had some conversations in the past here, and actually Sasha has brought it up as well. The notion that some of these agencies that exist that are supposed to be helping us on a world stage are not effective. I know that Sasha has brought up and others have brought up on the show that they feel that the UN gives a lot of lip service to humanitarian aid and a number of other things, but doesn't necessarily do an effective job of being true to the notion of being a force for good and to stop some of these conflicts. But as a activist in the peace community, I was wondering your thoughts about this and everything, because that is an agency that has been there for a number of years, and there are some folks that are concerned about its effectiveness.
Mark,
Well,
you're being polite when you say not effective.
Yeah, too much. The United Nations is ineffective. It's dominated by superpowers. It's the Security Council, not the General Assembly, that makes policy, can veto actions. And both Russia and the United States have wielded way too much power over the United Nations. That's just reality.
And what to do about that?
What to do about it is we need to democratize the entire planet, and the United Nations is part of that. We have people who are dying for lack of potable water. We have people who are starving on this planet while military contractors get more and more rich. That is a sin. That is a global atrocity that's going on every day.
Norman, I disagree with you. You cannot reform the present United Nations. You have to, first of all, Russia doesn't even have a place there, because the real member of United Nations and Security Council was Soviet Union, and when it ceased to exist in December of '91, the place became vacant. So Russia had to make an application to become that member replacing Soviet Union, which had to be approved by General Assembly and so on. That process never took place.
Well, with due respect, the idea that Russia shouldn't be in the United Nations is ridiculous.
Absolutely not. It has to apply.
It's ridiculous. It's silly.
No, it has to apply. Listen, you're giving Russia, I noticed, too much credit. This is a mafia state. This is a dangerous state. It has to be once and for all taking all nuclear forces away from Russia. George Bush Sr. could have done it, but he failed. And now it's time.
If you want to kick countries out of the United Nations because they're a dangerous state, you have to kick a lot of countries out of the United Nations.
But you don't have to kick out Russia because it's not there.
Well, it's there.
Russia, no,
like it or not.
Hey, Norman, hold a second. Norman, just really quickly, one of the things that we've also talked about on this show before, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about it because you're definitely in that activism space and all along those lines, is there is a notion, and Leo probably said that I'm being diplomatic again with this question as well, but there is a notion that political prisoners exist someplace else. They exist in another part of the world, and they don't necessarily exist here in the United States. But I'd love to hear your thoughts about that, because I personally think that whether it is the Black Panthers or AIM or a number of others, that we have political prisoners even here in the United States. But I'd love to hear your thoughts as you are in that space and may even know some of those people that might be labeled as such.
Well, the United States not only has its own political prisoners, but has supported actively with weapons and aid many other countries that have political prisoners. I'll give you a couple examples. President Biden went and fist bumped the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia a year ago. Saudi Arabia tortures its political prisoners. The United States sends more than $3 billion a year to the government of Israel, which has many Palestinian political prisoners. In my book, War Made Invisible, I chronicle the reality that Daniel Hale, a former U.S. Air Force official, is now in prison. He was a person who knew about the drone program. He disclosed to the media the reality that the vast proportion, sometimes close to 90% of U.S. drone strikes are killing civilians. He provided documents that proved it. He's in federal prison right now. He as well is a prisoner who we can call a political prisoner.
Can we define what a political prisoner is versus a criminal?
In prison because their political beliefs and actions for democracy.
And along those same lines, I was just curious, you mentioned earlier and everything, I definitely, and I don't think I'm speaking out of school because a lot of people here on this network know some of my political leanings, but while I was glad that we had the election of Barack Obama, there were some things that Barack Obama did that I did not approve of, namely the drone strikes, and there were some other things as well. But I just wonder your thoughts of Barack as a presidential leader and also a world leader, because there were definitely some things that he did that I felt were not correct. And I do know that there were even some folks in the liberal side that were not pleased with his presidency, and they felt that he did not do as much as he could have done, including in the space of military and world affairs, and definitely in the space of some of our domestic policies and all along those lines. But I was just wondering your thoughts of the Obama presidency, and also on the opposite side of that, the Trump presidency. You kind of alluded to both, but I'd love to hear both your thoughts on both.
Yeah. In foreign policy, President Obama did some good things like pushing ahead the Iran nuclear deal, but he also made the so-called war on terror, which is a war often of terror against other people in the world. President Obama made it bipartisan. He didn't need to do that, but he did it. And we've had enormous negative results as a consequence. President Trump is a neo-fascist. He's a racist. He's a nativist. He's a xenophobe. He's a misogynist. And he's somebody who has really driven down the standards of this country, and a very dangerous person representing a very dangerous now neo-fascist Republican Party.
Agreed.
Lee, you have any thoughts about the questions? I was going to turn it over to you as well. I know that you are a constitutional conservative, and you might have some thoughts and questions for Lee as well. I mean, for Norman as well.
Norman as well. In terms of political prisoners in the United States now, do you have any opinion on what's going on with not the violent January 6th protesters, but just the ones who happened to be there that day, who were let in by police, what have you, and they'll be charged with trespassing? But putting that issue aside, they're there, no trial yet. and confinement. Do you have any comment about these people?
Well, people should be facing charges and have a swift trial if they want one. The delay should come.
They do, and also solitary confinement.
Yeah, and I'm against solitary confinement in any country in the world. If it goes on for very long, many scholars have pointed out it's akin to torture. So I'm opposed to solitary confinement. The people who have been convicted, who led the attack on the Capitol on January 6th, should be in prison. If the evidence proved that they led that attack, they deserve to be imprisoned, and I think for a very long time. If people innocently were swept up in it, that's a whole other matter.
Is the public entitled to know what part of the government maybe entrapped people in terms of FBI agents on the ground that day participating?
Yeah, FBI should be subjected to scrutiny like every other agency. Donald Trump encouraged this. I think the idea that somehow the leaders of Oath Keepers and so forth, the idea that they are somehow victims of political repression is totally wrong. Those people consciously led, sometimes with weapons, an attack on the Capitol. And when that's proven, they should be in prison.
Hey, Norman, along those same lines,
the leader got 18 years in prison. Okay, so these things are moving in the right direction. And now there is a vacancy in Oath Keepers. The leader is getting paid $400 a week. So since he's gone into prison, so now there will probably election of a new leader in Oath Keepers. And there will be
Hey, Norman, along those same lines, and I was just wondering your thoughts. There are a number of agencies that have a lot of what some people would say is undue power and undue control of a number of things. And we can go back in history, we can go back to the Hoover era and everything, but there are folks that are thinking that there is too much power, including on some world issues, by the CIA, the FBI, the IRS, and a number of other agencies and everything. I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. And do those agencies have too much power and control?
We had the Church Commission led by Senator Church in the 1970s that exposed the tremendous abuse of power by the CIA. You go back further, and J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, had a vendetta against the civil rights movement. He had agents disrupting those who were organizing for civil rights for all Americans. That's the history. And we have to be very vigilant, but the United States Congress is not really providing the kind of oversight that's needed. The CIA ran torture chambers during the so-called War on Terror. They terrorized people, not just at Abu Ghraib, but they literally tortured people. And then when President Obama came in, rather than challenging the torture regime of George W. Bush and Dick Cheney, he said we have to look forward and not backward. Well, that's not accountability. Everybody should be equal under the law.
I'm sorry, Norman, why do you think Congress is looking the other way? They're complicit, are they not?
Yes. No, that's been going on for decades and decades. Absolutely complicit, a bipartisan complicity.
Yeah, and Norman, I have a question on this, because I thought, like you did, about Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, all joining NATO. And I thought, well, you can see why Putin is paranoid. But then after going and watching Sasha's show, which is broadcast from Kyiv, Ukraine, I changed my mind, and I disagree with what you're saying. And I'll tell you why. Because Sasha probably knows chess grandmaster Sergey Kudrin. Okay, I met Sergey in a chess tournament in Bermuda. He came from Novosibirsk, or whatever we call it, some city in the middle of Russia. And I go, why do you move in Soviet Union back then? Why'd you move here? He goes, do you know what it's like to live in hell? That was his statement about the Soviet Union. Then I watched Sasha's show, and I watched what they do over there. They kill, they rape, they plunder, they bully. It's like there's no question why, if you're in Estonia, and we have friends in Lithuania that are on our show, Latvia, Ukraine even, want to join NATO, because what you don't know in California is sitting over there in Russia is basically a group of people who hate you and would love to kill you, but not just kill you, torture you, and slaughter you. Now, we bring this on to our network, and I invite everybody to go watch the go join the Facebook group Understanding China, and then you'll understand these people are not your friends. So when you see the U.S. make these aggressive moves, which you look from the West Point, oh, this is not being fair. You haven't seen really what they do over there. And I happened to visit Russia. I enjoyed my time in St. Petersburg. But at the same time, if you look at what they do, then you can see the response of leaving Afghanistan was not the correct thing to do, because these people respond to one word, Norman, power.
Yeah, I don't know what these people mean.
Thank you, Bill Chamberlain, for your
excuse me.
advice.
The idea that we need to choose between the horrible militarists in the Kremlin and the horrible militarists in the White House, I think is wrong. We don't need to justify what Russia's doing. We should condemn it. We don't need to justify what the United States has been doing. We should condemn it when that policy is slaughtering people. When the United States slaughtered 3 million people in Vietnam, we don't say, oh, well, the Russians are bad. When the United States killed 300,000 civilians directly in the last 20 years, and several times that many, according to Brown University's Cost of War project, we don't say, oh, well, Russia's bad, so that's okay. If you're in Saudi Arabia and you're being tortured, you don't say, well, that's okay because the Russians are really bad. If you're a child, and I saw a child with one arm in Afghanistan bombed courtesy of US taxpayers, she didn't say when I met her at 7 years old with one arm, well, that's okay because the Russians are bad. So let's have a single standard here. Let's not get into the Cold War mentality and say, oh, we've got to choose up sides on the planet. Of course, we choose up sides behind those who are suffering. But to then say that one side or the other, the Kremlin or the White House, is A-OK, and it's okay for them to go ahead and slaughter, I think that's completely wrong.
Hey,
But how
hold
can you
on a
say it's
second. Hold on a second.
right?
Norman, hold
How do
on a
you say
second.
it's
Norman,
completely right to allow the Taliban to come in and then put women into situations where they have no education,
Well, let me
have
ask,
no future?
let me
and
ask you
that's
this, Nick.
your
Do
idea
you think
of
it, do you think it was
correct.
fine for the U.S. to cause the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Afghan civilians? That's A-OK because you don't like the Taliban?
No, and it has nothing to do with not liking the Taliban. It's what they do to
Yes,
their
but you
people.
are implying that it is worse. What the
Yes.
Taliban is doing is worse than
Yes.
what the U.S. is doing.
As
You
Sergei
don't seem
Kudrin said,
to
there's a lot of
equate
people would rather
the
be dead.
humanity of an Afghan person with a Ukrainian person. I think a Afghan person is no more or less important and valid as a human being than a Ukrainian person. We need a single
They
standard.
are important, but at the same time,
hold on a second.
they
Hold
do
on a
not
second.
want to be
Yeah.
destroyed
Nick,
by these
hold on
other
a second. Hold on a
I'm
second. I'm
sorry,
going to
if
actually
the
turn it over
choice
to
is
Sasha,
die or
too.
be raped and pillaged and destroyed. Ukraine chose the right thing to do. They would rather, I know this is hard for you to understand, Norman, they'd rather be dead than watch their women get raped and their property get stolen. Rather be dead.
Why are Ukrainians any more or less important than Afghans? They're both equally important. And when the
Afghans are
US
important
slaughters,
also.
that is just as bad as when Russia
But we
slaughters.
did not indiscriminately go out and kill
Yes,
all
we
the Afghans.
did. If you read my book, War Made Invisible, if you read the documentation from Anand Gopal, who reported for the New Yorker, the number of people who were terrorized year after year from the air by the US government with its bombers and missiles, they were terrorized and killed just as much as people elsewhere when we condemn. So let's have a single standard here.
A single
Norman,
standard
hold
is
on a
very
second.
simple. Hold on.
Yeah.
You live in America, and most of you there, and I'm in Canada, which is almost the same thing. What makes America really great, among other things, in industrial military complex? This is a backbone of American way of life. Because without that, America is a third world country with trillions, tens of trillions of deaths and so on. So everything holds together by military industrial complex. And it has to be extremely strong. It has to be fearful all over the world, because that makes U.S. economy strong, U.S. dollar strong. The debt is not so dangerous because nobody will ask nuclear powers of such magnitude to come up and pay this few $1 trillion here and there. Actually, they will say, we don't owe you anything. Actually, you owe us tens of trillions of dollars and pay it in next 24 hours. So this is the backbone of United States of America, of NATO, of all Western civilization. This is the paramount. This is number one. All these people who suffer and who are in jails and so on, it's a secondary. This is not that I'm supporting it. It should not be done. But this is a very, very, very secondary thing. Now, was Russia really threatened by anybody? So Russia took all its military might against its neighbor without any cause, without any things that Ukraine done anything wrong or whatever, and it's launched a huge attack against it. And
now, this is what I see as a problem when we say that certain human beings are secondary. If you want to say that 200,000 Yemeni people, many of them children.
No, listen, stop that populism. You comparing Ukrainian war with Yemeni, with the tribes fighting each other. No, please, it's all populist talk.
Oh, I see. You mean Yemeni people don't count?
No, they do. They do, but this is not the same what's happening in Ukraine. And I think this is very dangerous, very populist approach. Okay, Norman?
Norman, just really quickly and everything, because you kind of alluded to it, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about it and everything. But we're seeing these wars going on, and a lot of times the wars are controlled by major world powers. Like we can say whether that's Russia, US, and a number of other things. But one of the things that we talked about on this show a couple of times is that while this is going on, and it's the third power that exists in the conversation, even on a Sasha show, China is going down to Africa and a number of other places, and even the US, and influencing and buying up property and doing a number of other things. So I was just wondering, in your own thoughts and in your own notion of world politics, is that something that we should be concerned about as well? And we've also been having conversations around our own migration policy, whether we should be letting in migrants from Latin America and even some from Canada as well. But I was just wondering, and even India, but I was wondering your thoughts about the migrant population and also China investing and maybe even influencing some of the nations of the world. You mentioned Africa earlier, so I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Thanks. Yeah, let's talk about Africa in particular. I think whether it's the Wagner Group from Russia, whether it's the United States, which continues to engage in combat operations and drone strikes in Somalia and elsewhere in Africa, military operations with most of the governments and militaries on the entire continent of Africa, I think that's very, very dangerous. And I think China, for good or ill, and I think it's certainly better than going around killing people in Africa, China is doing massive investments in Africa. And unfortunately, it probably comes with strings attached. So I'm for Africa for Africans.
But you don't think a lot of those African nations being taken advantage of by those strings? And they're just ignorant or not?
Taken advantage of by what?
By China, by those strings attached.
Oh, yeah. No, I think that is a real hazard.
What are your thoughts about the migrant policy? Because that's something else that we've talked about on this show before. And I know that can sometimes be tied into the military conversation as well, because the Border Patrol, as my understanding, is sometimes tied into the military as well. But what is your thoughts about the way we are handling our migrant population?
Well, it's a really unusual thing to say, but I don't feel qualified to address that as an expert. My book is about the U.S. military and our wars. I think we do need to respect the human rights of immigrants. And except for Native Americans, we all come from immigrants on this continent, and we should respect their humanity, no matter where they come from.
Norbert, can we distinguish, though, between legal immigrants and illegal immigrants who came here ignoring our laws, our immigration laws?
Well, I think that there's a problem when we implicitly blame the problems of this country on illegal immigrants. And so we need a better system. Yeah, people should follow the rules, but let's face it, what the United States did in Honduras, for instance, which supported an illegal coup overthrowing a democratically elected government, and the role overall of the United States in Central America has caused a lot of the influx of people fleeing north because of the desperate circumstances. A lot of them are economic refugees.
Hey Norman, along those same lines, how much do you feel it is our military policy that sometimes plays into this? I'm thinking about Nicaragua. I'm thinking about a number of other places that are seen as our allies and the strategic allies, and that is why we let them get away with some things that might be considered human rights violations. Like I said, Nicaragua comes to mind. I could name some other Latin American countries, even some African countries and Asian countries. But I was just wondering, how much do we need to put them, you talked about that double standards, but how much do we need to hold them accountable when they are being our strategic allies?
You know, when we hear about how the United States must stand strong against nations that are repressive, that have political prisoners, that are killing in their own country and other countries those who do not comply with the wishes of the ruling regimes, one of the crucial things is that we, as Americans in the United States, should not be supporting governments that do those things. And so we have this weird thing going on where we're told how important it is for us to support those who oppose designated enemies like Russia and China, and certainly their repression and so forth should be condemned. But meanwhile, the US funneling billions of dollars worth of weapons. The United States is the largest arms peddler in the world. I give the example of Saudi Arabia, but there are many other regimes that are torturing their own people. And yes, it is a double standard. It's not only that we don't oppose them, the US government is supporting them. The Israeli government is a great example of how it has 5 million Palestinian people essentially in an open air prison in Gaza, suspending and removing any human rights that they have. And we're, as Americans, told that it's fine for all this US money to go there. I think it gets back to a single standard of human rights. That's what the planet needs.
Norman, those people in Israel, they're there for political speech or because they committed crimes, terrorist crimes?
Sorry, political speech.
Those in Israel that you spoke about.
They have no rights because they're Palestinian people in Gaza. They're occupied now for many, many decades, and they have no hope unless the United States...
Who's occupied?
Norman, you should know better than that why they are being occupied and why they are making all this terrorist attack against innocent civilians. And this is why Israel must control the territory the best it can to avoid the terrorist attack. They failed to build the state which they were awarded back several years ago. They failed. Israel built the state. The Palestinians did not. And they have no intention of building the state. All they want to do is a terrorist attack against the Israeli civilians. And that's not going to happen.
I think that's complete nonsense. And you look at the reality that the powerful force who has killed so many in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that's Israel. Israel has slaughtered vastly more Palestinians than the other way around.
I'm sorry, Norman, when you term slaughtered, you're implying intent of innocent civilians.
Pardon me?
When you're using the word slaughtered, you're implying intent to slaughter innocent civilians.
If you read my book, War Made Invisible, you'll see that the results, the predictable results, is what we have to be concerned with. If you had police officers in your town or mine spraying the storefronts of stores because they were chasing criminals, and predictably they would be killing innocent civilians who are shopping, we wouldn't say, oh, well, they didn't mean to do it, so it's okay. That's the kind of thing that goes
Norman,
on.
but if you have people who are using humans as human shields and spraying the police...
an excuse for U.S. foreign policy slaughtering other people.
No, I didn't say that.
It's not U.S. policy. Come on.
Well, that's the result.
That's not U.S. policy at
all.
all.
1 second, we got to get ready to go to Sasha's show and everything.
Okay.
Norman, I thoroughly enjoyed your
Bye-bye.
conversation, everything. If you can tell folks really quickly how you can be reached and all in that space and about how the book can be obtained. And I think I can speak of even some of the things that were said that folks on this panel may have disagreed with. I still would love to have you come back on and share some of your thoughts again if you are available at different times. But definitely we love having guests on a regular basis and love having them make return trips. But if you can tell how you can be reached and some of your ways that the book can be obtained and any other contact information that you would like to share.
Well, thank you. I'd love to hear from people. You just go to normansolomon.com. That's my name.com. And also, you can Google War Made Invisible, and all of the online booksellers will make it available to you. That's just War Made Invisible, a book that's just come out. I appreciate the chance to dialogue with everybody on this program, and thanks very much.
No problem at all. Definitely glad to have you on and all in that space. So we're getting ready to get on out of here. I know that actually that show that they were talking about is coming our way in a matter of a minute or so. And that will be Sasha and Ivan. I believe it's going to be on that show talking about, he comes from Kiev, talking about what's going on in that space and everything. And then later on, we've got some other shows, including Jeff Ahern, who is a comedian and also a activist, sometimes from the right, that'll have his show coming on at 1. And then we've got the Color Whisperer, which is an interior designing show out of California, coming at 2. And Good Ship Happens, which is about the cruise industry, at 3. And then Success for Women at 7, which is a business women show that is existing as well. So Norman, glad you were able to be on here, and hope to have you back in the near future. But right now we're getting ready to get on out of here.